The palace clock struck midnight, and the corridors of Buckingham fell silent, save for the faint echo of hurried footsteps and the soft rustle of silk against marble. Behind a hidden door, the future king stood with a woman the crown could never acknowledge. Her laughter was a rebellion in itself, a melody that defied centuries of royal obedience. Outside, the rain kissed the windows like a warning, as if the heavens themselves foresaw the ruin this love would bring. He whispered her name, not as a prince, but as a man chained from duty. Yet every heartbeat between them was treason. Every glance a step closer to catastrophe. For in the heart of the British monarchy, love was not a right. It was a weapon. And tonight, it was drawn. By morning, the palace resumed its masquerade of decorum. Edward sat beside his father at breakfast, his face a mask of royal serenity, while his heart still raced from the night's treachery. Letters had already begun to circulate, unsigned, venomous whispers hinting at impropriety. A courtier's knowing glance, a maid's stifled smirk. The palace walls were alive with rumor. He knew the crown's spies would not rest until they uncovered the truth. Eleanor, meanwhile, returned to her townhouse in Belgravia, her world suddenly heavier with the weight of secrecy. Each word they'd spoken now threatened to become evidence. For in the empire's heart, even love left a paper trail. That evening the city murmured with scandal. Anonymous telegrams found their way into drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs alike. Whispers of a royal entanglement with a married woman. Eleanor's name was never spoken aloud, yet it trembled on every tongue. The monarchy had survived wars, rebellions, and assassinations, but not scandal. Edward watched from a carriage window as headlines began to bloom, inked with speculation. He clenched his jaw, aware that his own heart had become the monarchy's greatest liability. In a quiet chapel within St. James, Eleanor knelt beneath stained glass light, praying not for forgiveness, but for courage. The air smelled of old incense and secrecy. When Edward entered, the sanctity of the place seemed to tremble. They spoke in whispers, of exile, of marriage, of what could never be. His hand lingered on hers for a moment too long before duty reclaimed him. "If they make me choose," he murmured, "they will lose their king." And in that confession, the fate of the crown began to shift. By nightfall, the queen had been informed. Her study, lined with portraits of monarchs past, felt colder than ever. She dismissed her attendants and sat alone, reading the brief report, His Royal Highness in private correspondence with Lady Fairchild. Her fingers tightened around the paper. The monarchy had been built upon sacrifice and silence, and now both were threatened by passion. In the distant corridor, the clock chimed again. Midnight. The same hour their love had begun. The following morning, the palace awoke to unease, cloaked in routine. Rumors had escaped the marble walls, slithering into the press rooms of Fleet Street. Edward's aides scrambled to suppress them, but truth, once loosened, has a way of finding air. In the drawing room, Edward faced his private secretary. The man's words precise but cold. "Your Highness, if this continues, the Prime Minister may intervene." The prince turned toward the window, the city glimmering in cruelly indifference. For the first time, he saw London not as his inheritance, but as a cage built from expectation and lineage. The crown demanded devotion. His heart demanded Eleanor. In Belgravia, Eleanor sat before her, vanity, her reflection fractured by candlelight. A letter from Edward lay open, tender, reckless, and ruinous. She knew his handwriting by heart, each loop and flourish a vow he should never have written. Outside, carriages rattled past, oblivious to the storm she was hiding. When her maid entered with trembling hands, Eleanor realized the whispers had reached her doorstep. The world was turning against them, and the walls of privilege were no shield. Not against love, not against betrayal. At Whitehall, the Prime Minister read the same report the Queen had seen. Only this time the implications were political, not personal. "A king in love with a commoner," he muttered, though his tone carried no amusement. The monarchy had to appear invincible, and Edward's defiance threatened centuries of illusion. Behind closed doors, plans began to form: isolation, persuasion, and if all else failed, removal. For power does not forgive romance, and history rarely spares the heart. That evening, Edward attended a royal banquet at Windsor, his first public appearance since the rumors began. Every glance, every curtsy, every toast carried a silent accusation. Eleanor was absent, yet her presence haunted the room more fiercely than any ghost. The orchestra's melody faltered under the weight of scandal. As Edward raised his glass, he saw the Queen across the table, her gaze fixed, her disappointment colder than marble. Between them, centuries of obedience trembled on the edge of collapse. Late that night, Edward found himself in the palace gardens, beneath the same sky that once sheltered his secret meetings. The scent of rain lingered, mingling with memories of Eleanor's laughter. From the darkness, a familiar figure approached. His younger brother, Prince Albert. "They'll destroy you for her," Albert warned softly. Edward turned, his expression unreadable. "Then let them," he replied, and in that moment, the heir to the British throne chose love over the institution that had birthed him, a decision that would soon bring the monarchy to its knees. The morning newspapers carried their betrayal in black ink: "A monarch in love," "The scandal that shakes the empire," the photograph, a blurred image of Edward's car outside Eleanor's townhouse, was enough to ignite fury within every corner of the Commonwealth. Inside Buckingham Palace, the Queen's advisors convened an emergency council. Edward was summoned but did not appear. Instead, he rode through Hyde Park, seeking the illusion of freedom in the crisp winter air. Every breath he drew felt like defiance. The monarchy had weathered centuries of storms, but never one born from the heart. The question that haunted the nation now whispered through every corridor: what happens when a king refuses to be one? At her townhouse, Eleanor stared at the same headline, tears threatening but never falling. The world now knew her name. Invitations vanished, doors closed, and allies became strangers. Still, she refused to yield. That evening, she wrote to Edward, "If your crown demands my silence, then I will vanish. But if your heart still calls for me, I will not hide." She sealed the letter with trembling hands, knowing it might be the last she ever sent him. Outside, flashbulbs popped as journalists gathered like vultures, their cameras ready to devour the woman who had captured a king. "What?" The Queen summoned Edward to Windsor. The air between them was brittle, heavy with duty. "You have placed your heart above your country," she said, each word clipped with decades of restraint. Edward's reply was simple, almost gentle. "Perhaps my heart is the only honest thing left in this house." Silence followed. Not the silence of peace, but a fracture. Behind the Queen's composed gaze lay the fear every monarch dreads: that love could prove stronger than the crown itself. That night, Edward returned to London and found Eleanor waiting in the shadows of his private residence. No guards, no courtiers, only two souls against the empire. "They will strip you of everything," she warned. "Then let them," he whispered, his hands trembling against hers. It was not a promise of defiance, but surrender. To love, to fate, to history. In that moment, the weight of the monarchy lifted, if only briefly, replaced by something fragile, yet eternal. But outside, the world had already begun to turn against them. By dawn, the government had reached its decision. If Edward would not renounce Eleanor, he must renounce the throne. The Archbishop's letter, written in language both sacred and political, arrived at the palace with chilling formality. The Queen read it in silence before passing it to her son. Edward unfolded the parchment, the royal seal cracking like thunder in the still air. His destiny, once carved in gold, now trembled in ink, and as he looked toward the window, toward the light breaking over London, he knew that the crown, long a symbol of divine right, had never felt so hollow. The council chamber was colder than the season itself. Ministers gathered around a long oak table, papers spread like evidence at a trial. Edward entered without bowing, the weight of centuries pressing against his spine. "You cannot marry her," the Prime Minister declared, voice steady but brittle. "Then I cannot be your king," Edward replied. The words hung in the air like smoke. Heresy dressed in truth. Silence followed, broken only by the scratching of pens recording the moment history unraveled. Somewhere in London, church bells rang for morning service. Unaware, they tolled for the death of a reign. In her townhouse, Eleanor paced as the minutes crawled. Every tick of the clock was a hammer striking her nerves. She had begged Edward not to choose her over his birthright, yet she knew he already had. Outside, a restless crowd had gathered, some shouting her name with adoration, others with venom. Love had never felt so dangerous. When Clara drew back the curtains, Eleanor saw the posters, "Save our King," but not her name. The world would remember him. She would be erased, as history always erases its women. That night, the Queen requested a private audience with her son. Gone was the sovereign. Before him stood only a mother. "You would give up 1,000 years of legacy for her?" she asked, voice trembling between fury and grief. "For her," Edward said softly, "and for myself." Her eyes filled with unshed tears. The monarchy demanded loyalty, but it had stolen their humanity. She reached for his hand, a gesture of love and surrender, knowing that by morning, the world would change forever. The statement was prepared at dawn. Edward's signature, bold and final, would soon echo through every newspaper and radio in the empire. Yet before the ink dried, he summoned Eleanor to the palace one last time. They met in the library, where dust and history hung thick in the air. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "this was not my loss. It was my freedom." She wept not from guilt but from awe, for she understood the enormity of what love had undone. Outside, Big Ben struck noon, each chime sealing the fate of a king who chose his heart. The evening broadcast began at 6. Radios across Britain crackled to life as Edward's voice, calm and resolute, filled parlors, pubs, and churches alike. "I have found it impossible to discharge my duties as king without the help and support of the woman I love." Millions listened in silence. Some wept, others raged, and a few quietly understood. In that moment, the monarchy shed its illusion of perfection. As the final words faded, the Queen sat alone by the window, watching the rain begin again. And in the heart of London, the woman who changed history blew out her candle, her part in the story complete, her love immortal. Paris greeted them not with celebration but with silence. Edward and Eleanor arrived beneath gray skies, the hum of the city muffled by scandal that had crossed the channel before them. The grandeur of exile was an illusion. Their villa on the outskirts of Neuilly-sur-Seine was beautiful, yet haunted by the ghost of a lost throne. Edward walked its halls restlessly, still hearing the echo of the crown he had laid down. For Eleanor, love had triumphed, but at an impossible price. He was free, but diminished. Hers, yet haunted. The empire had turned its back on them, but she would not. Not now, not ever. Weeks passed. Invitations from Parisian society arrived in abundance, more curiosity than kindness. The former king became a spectacle. The woman beside him, a scandal draped in silk. At their first soirée, whispers fluttered like moths around them. Edward's smile was polite, mechanical. Eleanor's laughter, brave but brittle. "They look at me as if I stole something," she murmured. "You did," he replied softly. "You stole their obedience." They danced that night beneath crystal chandeliers, two exiles glowing in borrowed light, royalty without a kingdom, but not without power. In London, the monarchy moved on. Edward's brother, now crowned George VI, stood before Parliament as the nation's new hope. But even as his reign began, shadows lingered. Edward's name, whispered in corners, a reminder of the fragility beneath the crown's polish. For Queen Mary, the loss was twofold: a son and the illusion of control. She read letters from Paris in private, her tears hidden behind lace handkerchiefs. The monarchy had survived, but at a terrible cost: the human heart. Back in Paris, Edward and Eleanor found their rhythm in the quiet hours. Mornings of coffee and letters, afternoons of walks along the Seine. Yet sometimes she would find him staring at the horizon, toward a land he would never again call home. "Do you regret it?" she once asked. He smiled faintly. "Only when I remember what I was meant to be." In that answer, she heard both his love and his mourning. They had escaped the palace, but not the ghosts it left behind. Winter settled over France, and with it came peace, the fragile kind born from surrender. On Christmas Eve, Edward placed a small velvet box in Eleanor's hands. Inside lay a ring, not royal but real, carved simply with the words, "For love, not duty." She looked up, eyes glistening, and for the first time since their exile began, smiled without restraint. In that quiet room, far from thrones and crowns, they found what kingdoms never could: a happiness untouched by power, and a love ungoverned by rule. Years had passed since the abdication, yet scandal, like shadow, never truly faded. Edward and Eleanor's peace began to fracture when word arrived from London. The king was ill. The letter bore his mother's crest, her handwriting trembling with age and regret. Edward read it in silence, the past stirring like dust in a long-closed hall. "They need you," Eleanor said softly. He met her gaze, torn between love and lineage once more. The man who had defied a crown now faced the one thing he could not outrun: his blood. In London, the crown prepared for transition once again. King George's condition worsened and whispers began to circle through Parliament. Should the Duke of Windsor return? For many, he was a symbol of disgrace. For others, a rightful heir betrayed by love. Within the palace, Queen Mary sat by her second son's bedside, the ghosts of both duty and heartbreak haunting her every breath. "You cannot summon him," she whispered to the Prime Minister. His return would unmake us all. But in the depths of her heart, she longed to see the son she had lost. Not the king, but the boy who once believed love could save him. Edward returned to England under a veil of secrecy. The streets he once ruled over greeted him with polite indifference. Outside the palace gates, no crowds waited, no anthems played, only the quiet hum of a city that had learned to forget. Inside, he found his mother frailer, her authority softened by years and sorrow. "You shouldn't have come," she said, though her eyes betrayed relief. "I never truly left," he answered. The air between them was thick with everything unsaid: love, regret, and the knowledge that some exiles last a lifetime, even in the homeland. While Edward stood beside his brother's sickbed, Eleanor remained in Paris, her solitude heavy as the winter fog. Letters from Edward grew infrequent, and each silence stretched longer than the last. Whispers began again, of old loyalties rekindled, of power creeping back into Edward's thoughts. She stared at the photographs on the mantel. A crown abandoned, a love defied. Had the man she loved returned to the world she saved him from? The same empire that once condemned them now called him useful. In exile's quiet heart, betrayal began to bloom. When George passed, the bells of Westminster tolled, not for a king, but for a dynasty wounded by love and loss. Edward stood beside the coffin, his reflection caught in its polished surface. Around him, courtiers avoided his gaze. The Queen approached, her voice trembling. "He forgave you, you know." Edward nodded, but forgiveness no longer mattered. As the choir sang, He felt the final tie to the crown dissolve. When he returned to Paris, Eleanor met him at the door, tears and anger colliding in her eyes. "Did you go to mourn him?" she asked. "Or to mourn the king you might have been?" The years that followed were kind to neither of them. Paris, once their sanctuary, had become a museum of ghosts. Edward's health waned. His hands, once steady with defiance, now trembled when he tried to write. Eleanor cared for him in silence, her love enduring where power had long since faded. Each morning she read aloud from the London papers. Royal weddings, new heirs, a monarchy reborn without him. "Do you miss it?" she asked one morning. "No," he whispered. "Only the boy who thought it would last." The sunlight on the drapes flickered like the last breath of a kingdom. As spring returned to Paris, Edward began to dictate his memoirs, not of battles or treaties, but of love and consequence. "History," he murmured, "will call me a fool, but it was the only truth I ever lived." Eleanor wrote every word, her ink trembling with devotion. At night, she read his drafts by candlelight, her tears blurring the sentences that history would later censor. In those pages, they preserved what the crown had tried to erase, a love story that had changed a kingdom's soul. One evening, as the church bells tolled across the Seine, Eleanor found Edward gazing at the twilight sky. "It's strange," he said softly, "how the stars still shine for men who have lost their crowns." She smiled through her grief, taking his hand. "You never lost it," she whispered. "You just gave it meaning." He closed his eyes, a faint smile touching his lips, not of victory, but of peace. For the first time, his heart and his history no longer fought each other. In love's quiet twilight, the king finally rested. When Edward passed, it was in his sleep, the dawn light resting softly across his face. Eleanor awoke beside him, knowing before she touched him that he was gone. She did not cry. Not at first. She dressed in silence, opened the window, and let the morning breeze carry through the room. Below, the city continued as if nothing had changed. Yet in that quiet villa, history shifted again. Not with coronations or abdications, but with the breath of a woman who had loved a king into eternity. Years later, visitors to a small Parisian cemetery would find two graves side by side. One marked Edward, Duke of Windsor, the other Eleanor Fairchild, beloved beyond measure. Time had softened the scandal. What once shook an empire was now a whisper of romance carried by wind and roses. The monarchy endured, changed but unbroken. Yet in the quiet of that foreign soil, a truer kingdom reigned, one built not on duty or lineage, but on love that defied them both. And as the church bells tolled far away in London, the world finally understood. The crown may claim nations, but the heart claims eternity.